During the Second World War, there was a strong shared feeling among the Western Allies that what they were fighting for was the freedom of the individual, and that this meant in practice defending liberal democratic institutions. This feeling saturates the only major work of political philosophy to have been written during that war, The Open Society and Its Enemies by Karl Popper, published in 1945. And for a couple of decades after the war, there was something like a liberal consensus in the Western democracies. So much so that in the Anglo-Saxon world, academics started talking about the end of ideology, as if there were no more political arguments left to have over fundamentals. And in England, a slogan which came to be widely quoted in academic circles was, "Political philosophy is dead." Well, perhaps a reaction against this was inevitable sooner or later. And when it began to show itself in the mid-1960s, it came from both directions, right and left. Conservatives began to feel that in some ways there was now too much freedom for the individual, for instance as regards sexual permissiveness and pornography and the use of drugs, and a failure to keep down crime, especially crimes of violence. And they felt too that a whole generation of young people had now been allowed to grow up in this atmosphere without the restraints of traditional disciplines and punishments, and that the results manifesting themselves were disastrous. Meanwhile, from the far left, many of whose members were among the new so-called permissive generation, liberal democratic regimes were being attacked for entirely different reasons. From that quarter, they were accused of making little serious attempt to redistribute wealth or abolish poverty. The societies over which they presided were said to be class-ridden and racist and sexist. And worst of all, they were held responsible for the unnecessary prolongation of a bestial war in Vietnam. So, debate over fundamentals in politics began again in earnest. And now the debate was about the validity of the very kind of liberal democratic institutions that formerly had been taken for granted. Perhaps because these controversies were at their hottest in the United States, it was there that the chief figures to be thrown up by this new wave of political thought emerged. As far as analytic philosophers working in universities are concerned, far and away the most influential figure to emerge from this situation has been John Rawls, a professor at Harvard, with his book A Theory of Justice. Another much discussed book is Anarchy, State and Utopia by another Harvard professor, Robert Nozick. If one were to add a third name to this list, it would be that of our protagonist in this program, Ronald Dworkin, also an American and a former professor at Yale, but now resident in England as professor of jurisprudence at Oxford. Professor Dworkin's recent book, Taking Rights Seriously, has been met with acclaim which ranges all the way from the severest academic approval to a feature article in Time magazine, which latter I take to be an indication that it's having some influence on popular as well as academic thinking. Professor Dworkin, before I start questioning you specifically about your work and that of your colleagues, is there anything you'd like to add to what I've just said by way of introduction to this program about the historical and social context in which your work has emerged?
Well, I think one or two things are interesting. It's interesting, isn't it, the degree to which many of the social problems in America that you spoke about came out of the racial issue. How many of them had to do with the civil rights movement in the first instance, and then with the special problem caused by extensive welfare programs in cities like New York, which principally helped the blacks and which were increasingly at the expense of people who formerly thought of themselves as the working classes, the taxi drivers, for example, who began to question premises that were no longer benefiting them but benefiting people still worse off. There's another dimension to it, I think, that was interesting, and that is this. When the left attacked first policy in Vietnam and then liberalism generally, they took themselves to be attacking not just a particular political theory, but the whole idea of a rational, well-worked-out political theory in general. So I think you can say that when, for example, Jack Rawls wrote his book, A Theory of Justice, that you have mentioned, it was on the one hand a defense of traditional liberal values. It was also at the same time a defense of the whole idea of using philosophy to support political positions.
What were the academic roots or precursors, so to speak, of this new emergence of political thinking?
I think that the most important development in the academy that directly fed into the rebirth of political philosophy was in economics. Economists had for a long time been concerned in a rather vague way with the whole idea of what makes a society better off. But in the period just after the war, there was a great deal of concern with doing that in a formal way. That is, attempting to give numbers and figures and graphs to say when a society, by virtue of some change that helped some people to the disadvantage of other people, when you could say that nevertheless the society was better off as a whole. The work of Kenneth Arrow was very important in this country, Caldor and Hicks and so forth. So it seems to me the developments in formal economics, welfare theory economics, were very important. In America, particularly, developments in academic law were also important. In this country, it's not generally thought of, the law schools are not generally thought of places where debates of political principle take place, but they are in the United States. One of the reasons for that, of course, is the importance of the Supreme Court in deciding issues of great constitutional principle. And in the period after the war, through the 50s, indeed through the 60s, great issues of principle were decided by the Supreme Court. For large part, they had to do with questions about how you could treat accused criminals, for example. But since these questions were decided by courts, they were questions for argument at the level of principle, which took place in law school. And Nozick's book, for example, which you've mentioned, shows, it seems to me, the print of a legal style of thinking about social questions. So I do think these two developments, economics on the one hand and law on the others, were academic precursors, in your phrase.
Yeah. I said earlier that Rawls was far and away the most influential of the analytic philosophers to have emerged from this recent situation. I take it you would agree with that.
Yes, absolutely. There's no doubt about that. You see Rawls' name now in so many different contexts. It's hard to read a legal treatise, for example, without seeing him mentioned 2 or 3 times. Talks to the nation, in this country as well as in America, on social policy, questions of welfare. Always the almost obligatory reference now to Rawls. Sometimes in such language as to make me think they don't understand the book, but nevertheless, it's an obligatory reference. Great influence.
Is it possible for you, before we get down to a specific consideration of what he says, to say why he's having this kind of influence?
Yes. I think there are 2 reasons why. First, something we've just said, that is that he stands not only for a particular theory, but for a majestic demonstration of the power of argument in politics. And I think people are once again attracted to the idea that a sustained argument, which begins with things that are said to be plausibly taken to be first principles, can come down and actually tell us what to do about tort law, about the distribution of milk to school children or something of that sort. I think that impresses people very much. Secondly, we'll come on to this, no doubt, but I think the conclusions that he reaches have, quite apart from the argument, enormous, intuitive appeal to people of goodwill. They're very attractive conclusions.
Well, now let's start considering them. I know this is a very tall order, but is it possible for you to characterize comparatively briefly, I mean within the context of a television discussion, what it is that Rawls is saying?
Yes, I think for that purpose it would be a good idea to take up 2 topics in the book. The first is the topic of the method he suggests and employs, and the second, the conclusions he reaches. And I think it's useful to distinguish them because some people are impressed with the one and not the other. The method is arresting, it's intriguing. Rawls tells us that when we're concerned with questions of justice, what rules that could govern the basic structure of a society would be just, that we ought to think about those in the following way. We ought to tell ourselves a fairy story, for a start. We ought to imagine a Congress of men and women who don't belong to any particular society yet, and who come together in a kind of constitutional convention. They're going to agree among themselves on a constitution, how their society is to be run. And they're like everybody else, these people. They have specific identities, specific weaknesses, specific strengths, specific interests. Only thing that makes them different is that they suffer from a total amnesia, the most crippling kind of amnesia. They don't know who they are. They don't know whether they're old or young, men or women, black or white, talented or stupid. In particular, this is very important, they don't know what their own individual moralities are. That is, they don't know Each one has some conception of what he wants his life to be like, what his preferences are in sexual morality and so forth, but no one knows what his views are on those questions. So it's as if, as in Rawls's phrase, they were separated from their own personalities by a veil of ignorance. Now, these amnesiacs nevertheless must agree on a political constitution. Rawls says if we ask ourselves what people in this strange situation would agree upon by way of a constitution, that the answer to that question will be, for that reason, principles of justice.
This is a somewhat far-fetched thing to ask people to assume, isn't it?
Well, it's of course far-fetched to ask them to assume that it ever has happened or could happen.
Yeah.
It's a dramatic way of asking people to imagine themselves making choices in their own self-interest, but without knowing things which separate one person from another. And that's, of course, just a way of enforcing a certain conception of equality on political decisions. But for the moment, I think it's better not to leave behind the myth, because the myth has itself great power. Now, the question is, what would people in this situation agree upon? And that's the second question, namely, the second topic, namely, what conclusions does this method yield? These are two, and Rawls calls them the two principles of justice. They are principles, I should say, for a society with a certain measure of economic development, so that there's enough to feed everyone. Once you reach that point, says Rawls, people in the original position, as he calls this strange situation, would agree on the following two principles. First, everyone shall have, to the greatest degree possible, the basic liberties which Rawls enumerates. These basic liberties are the conventional political liberties: liberty to vote, liberty to speak on political matters, freedom of conscience. They also include freedom to hold personal property, to be protected in your person, not to be arrested suddenly and without due cause, and so forth. The conventional, what you might call liberal liberties, are protected in this way. Secondly, the second principle of justice, no inequality in society, in distribution, no difference in wealth, is to be tolerated unless that difference works for the benefit of the worst off group in the society. It's a very dramatic principle, the second principle. It means that if you could change society by making it overall poorer, so the middle class, for instance, was substantially worse off, you should do so if the result of that is to benefit the lowest off group in the society. So you have two principles. The first is the principle that says there are certain liberties that must be protected. The second is the rather more egalitarian principle that says, look to the situation of the worst off group. Every change in the social structure should benefit that group. The two principles are related through what Rawls calls the principle of priority. He calls it a lexicographic ordering, and says that the first principle dominates over the second. What that means is that even if, for example, it would benefit the worst off group in the society to abridge political liberties, take away rights of free speech, even if that would benefit the worst off groups in society, you must not do it. Only when liberty has been protected to the full are you entitled to consider the economic questions raised by the second principle. When you do come to those economic considerations, you must benefit the worst off class, but you can't do that until everyone's liberties are sufficiently protected.
What do you yourself regard as the chief shortcomings of the theory?
I think that Rawls relies too much on rather technical arguments, appealing in a very learned way to recent work in economics about what people in his original position would do. And I think those arguments are to some degree flawed. That is, it doesn't seem to be inevitable that people in his original position would come out with just what he does. I think what's more important, and what I wish he had stressed more, is the deep theory that underlies the use of this device, the sort of thing that you ask for when you say, quite rightly, why should what people decide in this rather strange situation, why should that have to do with justice? So I think it's a weakness that he, as it were, hides the real question, appears to hide the real question. But I also think that's the great strength of the book. That is, this is the kind of a book in which the usefulness, the importance of the book is not exhausted by the particular arguments it makes. It presents us with an enterprise and says to us, look, if these conclusions are appealing to you, if the idea that we must think about justice by thinking about them through these devices of fairness is at all appealing, why is that so? Doesn't this tell us something about our philosophical capacities? Doesn't it tell us something about our moral capacities that we think this? Doesn't it help to structure how we think about it? Now, it's an enterprise. Rawls' book, one of the reasons why it's so important is that it's launched an enterprise of thinking along these lines, of which he would be the first to say that this book is only the beginning. Each person who reads it will have a different vision of what the enterprise is. I, for one, have a particular way of reading this book that makes it seem more important to me. And that is this. It does seem to me that the great question, the root question for liberalism, by liberalism, of course, I don't mean party politics, and I'm not referring to the Liberal Party as a party in this country. I mean the philosophic doctrine, the philosophic political theory called liberalism. The root question, it seems to me, is this. There are two possible approaches to the question of what is just. What is justice in community? One theory says that the answer to what is justice, what arrangements of goods in society is just, depends upon the answer to a further question, namely, what kinds of lives should men and women lead? What counts as excellence in a human being? One theory says, treat people as excellent people, according to some theory, would wish to be treated. The liberal rejects that notion of justice. He says that justice has a call upon institutions which is independent of any particular notion of what the good life is, but rather can appeal to people as a way of regulating society that can be agreed upon rationally by people who hold very different kinds of theories of, let's say, personal morality. This book is an attempt to show how far an appealing and altruistic and humane political theory can be generated consistent with the basic postulate of liberalism on this conception, namely that it's neutral amongst the various personal moralities that people hold. And that's a very important ambition.
Would it be a fair paraphrase of what you've just said to say this, that people both to the left and to the right of liberals differ from liberals in one very important respect, namely this, that both conservatives and people of the radical left tend to regard the individual as predominantly a social animal, and to think that a political theory not only usually does, but should embody within itself a conception of how individuals should live. Whereas the liberal is someone who thinks that how individuals should live is ultimately something for individuals themselves to decide. And therefore, that you're not looking for a theory of society which itself takes that decision.
Yes.
And
not because, I agree with that, not because the liberal is skeptical, not because the liberal says there is no answer to the question, how should human beings live, but rather because he insists, for a variety of reasons, that the answer must be given for each person, by each person for himself, and that it's the utmost insult to attempt to decide socially that question for individuals.
And one of his criticisms of the conservative or the radical left would be that they assume that it's the same answer for everyone. Whereas part of his belief is that different individuals will have different answers for themselves.
Yes, not because he assumes that different answers are right. He needn't be a relativist.
No.
But just because he insists that it robs people of personality and dignity to answer for them whether they give the right or the wrong answer.
In fact, far from believing that the answers are necessarily right, the real liberal will passionately believe in the right of others to live in ways of which he disapproves.
Yes.
Well
passionately.
Passionately, as you say. Well, now, This book of Rawls, one very striking thing about it is that it spawned an instant literature, and it was only published in 1971, and already half a dozen years later, there are several other books in print on the library shelves in bookshops about it.
Yes.
This is very remarkable. I can't remember when a whole literature emerged so quickly out of a single book as it's done out of this. You said what you yourself regard as the most interesting or important discussion points in Rawls. Are there any others with which you may not necessarily yourself directly sympathize very strongly, which are nevertheless interesting to large numbers of the other critics or writers about this book?
Large part of the work on Rawls has been, as you indicate, critical. That is, they have pointed out the flaws in the argument that lead from the original position to the conclusion. I described one of the arguments a minute ago, and I said he's assuming that people are all conservative, whereas they might be gamblers. Another part of the literature is, and I think more interesting part of the literature, is critical of the conclusions. And this comes from both the right and from the left. The criticism from the right says that it's absurd to suppose that we should be ridden by concern for the worst off group. There are values more important, for example, cultural values, that it's important to perpetuate even if maldistribution or inequitable distribution is the result. Criticism from the left is more complex. It fixes, first of all, on the first of the principles that I offered and says, Rawls says that when liberty and further equality conflict, liberty is to be preferred. And there are positions on the left which contest this and say that it's a bourgeois, middle-class, liberal view. The second criticism from the left fixes on the second principle. When I described it, I said the second principle said there shall be no inequalities except as benefit the worst off group. A criticism, let us say, from the far left holds that inequalities are bad even if they do benefit the worst off group, so that we should prefer a society of complete equality even if everyone is worse off, including those who would be worst off under a Rawlsian distribution.
That strikes me as being a masochistic view, but it is held by some serious people.
Oh, it is indeed, who make the argument that envy or resentment is itself such a divisive thing that the self-respect, the damage to self-respect that comes from seeing others better off in a social structure is such a malign influence on personality that it's wrong to suppose, in effect, that they can be better off if they're materially better off, but other people are better off still. Yes, it's a view that's very strongly held. I would say of all the criticisms of Rawls, the one most fiercely contested is this seemingly cut off your nose to spite your face view.
Well, I don't think I want to go any further into that. What I'd like to do, Professor Dworkin, is I think you've given, if I may say so, an excellent exposition of Rawls in an almost impossibly short space of time. And I'd like to move on now from Rawls to the other important book that I named apart from your own, namely Anarchy, State and Utopia by Robert Nozick. I wouldn't ask you to deal with that at such length as we've just discussed Rawls, but I think it's not so important to do so as it hasn't been quite so influential. But could you do, as it were, do more briefly for Nozick what you've just done for Rawls?
I'll try. Nozick starts his argument with remarkable proposition. It's remarkable in its simplicity. Individuals have rights, he says, and there are some things that cannot be done to them without violating their rights. Well, that's an unexceptional statement. Of course that's so. But then we find out what these rights are. And it turns out that the Nozickian rights have this force, that it is wrong either to injure a person or take away his property for any reason except with his consent, unless to do so is necessary to protect someone else's rights to his property or his person. Now, this means, this is very, very strong. Indeed, it's so strong that one might ask, is it possible to have a state at all that respects that principle? And surprisingly, the first third and the most densely argued part of Nozick's book is presented as a defense of the state itself against the anarchist. Nozick obviously takes this as no mean question. And obviously it isn't. After all, if you take my property away from me, then you have violated my rights. I have a right to take it back. But a state claims a monopoly of the power to use force. The state claims the right to stop me from taking back my property against you. I've got to go to the police and ask them to do it.
It prevents you from taking the law into your own hands,
yes,
as every state must.
Yes, but what it's done is to violate my right, because it stopped me from doing something which I have every right, according to Nozick, to do, namely to protect my own property, which was wrongly taken from me. Nevertheless, Nozick agrees that if everyone did take the law into his own hands, there'd be anarchy. So the question is, what's wrong with anarchy? And his argument here is very elaborate. It may or may not work. There's a considerable doubt about it. But in any event, the upshot of the argument is that there can be a state. There can be what Nozick calls a night watchman state, which means a state that exists simply to protect property and person, to punish people on behalf of other people. Question then arises, can the state do any more than that? After all, modern states do a lot more than that. They tax you and me and use the money they get in taxes to help other people, to do things in the common interest. Nozick gives that question a very firm answer. No. The state may not do anything except act as a night watchman. It may not tax, for example, for any purpose other than supporting the police. There are no doubt a lot of people listening who would feel some sympathy with that view. Yeah. And Nozick has been rather popular in certain political circles for at least this part of his views. Now, what argument could he give for this defense of what he calls the minimal or night watchman state? Well, his argument is this, in large part. Its argument is typically ingenious and complex, but I think the main thrust of it comes to this. He asks us to distinguish between two kinds of theories about what he calls justice in distribution. We each have certain things in society which we own, and the question is that distribution just? Now, says Nozick, one theory is what he calls a historical theory, and that says this. The present holdings are just. What you own, you justly own, provided people gave it to you voluntarily, either as a gift or in return for what you did for them. If, however, it was taken away from anyone else, by taxation, for example, and then given to you, the holding is not just. This, of course, makes holdings, this, of course, would tolerate the most inequitable distribution you can imagine. The second kind of theory, says Nozick, of justice, doesn't appeal just to history as his does, who gave who to what, but rather offers some general pattern and says, let us look at how the thing ended up. The simplest form of a patterned theory, as Nozick calls them, is an egalitarian theory. Unless things ended up equal, it's wrong, even if it was all done voluntarily. Now, Nozick says only a patterned theory could oppose his view of the limited power of the state. Because if the state is going to intervene to take money away from some and give it to others, it must be in pursuit of a pattern. Nozick, therefore, wishes to argue that any patterned theory is intolerable. And his argument goes like this. He says, suppose you could collect all the holdings, sweep up everyone's wealth, and then distribute it all according to your favorite pattern. Suppose you're an egalitarian, you distribute the same amount to everyone. Now, you turn your back, and people are going to begin trading with one another. Suppose, he says, he uses here the name of a very famous American basketball player called Wilt Chamberlain. He said, suppose Wilt Chamberlain plays basketball extremely well, which he does, and people wish to pay money. He doesn't wish to play basketball, but people give him money, ask him to play basketball. He's going to end up with more money than anybody else. In order to stop that, you are going to have to interfere with liberty to a constant degree. To stop these transactions, stop people from doing what they wish to do, you're going to have a dictatorship. You will not preserve a pattern of justice, if that's what you want, without the most serious inroads on people's freedom. Therefore, you can't have a pattern theory of justice. Therefore, the only tolerable state is his state, namely the night watchman or minimal state.
Well, this seems to be based fundamentally on a concept of the importance of free exchange.
Yes.
Would that be right?
Yes.
That seems to be absolutely the root.
It comes back to this notion of consent.
Yes.
Anytime
yes.
you lose something, it must be with your consent.
Yes, yes. What would you advance as the chief criticisms of Nozick's theory?
Two. First, that his notion of what basic rights people have, namely this right not to lose their property except with their consent, simply arbitrary. There is some appeal in that right, but there's also plenty of appeal in competing rights, which would have to sanction inroads against it. For example, I see nothing less appealing, just as an intuitive beginning point, with the notion that people have a right to the concern of others when they are in desperate situation themselves. Now, that obviously is going to sanction things being done that Nozick's basic principle wouldn't permit. Nozick has no argument for his basic right, in my view. He simply presents it as a starting point, and therefore it's an arbitrary study. He starts too far along with an arbitrary position. Secondly, I think, as the Wilt Chamberlain argument I gave you, I think well illustrates, his arguments tend to be all-or-nothing arguments. They're ingenious, but there are many of them of the form, it would obviously be impossible to prevent any exchanges. Therefore, it follows that automatically, if that's a great injustice, a little interference with liberty is also an injustice, possibly a smaller one. And of course, that doesn't follow.
And in fact, in American society and British society, we do have the state interfering constantly with these exchanges, but it would be quite untrue to say that this constitutes dictatorship.
Yes, exactly. There's a certain threshold of interference, a threshold of degree and kind. Obviously, taxing a man, taxing Wilt Chamberlain at the end of the year and saying you've got to give back half of what you've earned, is not the kind of interference with liberty that it would be to say no one can pay money to see him play basketball. Those are two different things.
I want finally to come to your own work, Professor Dworkin. How do you, perhaps in the light of the discussion we've had up to this point, how do you relate what you're doing to what Rawls and Nozick are doing?
Well, if you look at it from a certain distance, some people would say a great distance, I think we're all working the same street in a way. That is, if you take the conception of liberalism that I offered a few minutes ago, and you very well summarized by saying that the liberal has this view which distinguishes him both from the left and the right, namely that the right way to live must not be a matter of political concern. Then each of us, it seems to me, can be seen as in some way protecting or trying to defend that idea of liberalism. But nevertheless, we disagree. I tend, of course, as you will have gathered, I tend to be much closer in sympathy to Rawls than to Nozick. But one way of summarizing the disagreement, it seems to me, would be to pay attention to this supposed conflict between liberty and equality. People make a great deal of this. You might say that Nozick is off on one side. Nozick says liberty is everything. Equality counts for nothing, except as it's the accidental result of free transactions, which is extremely unlikely. So liberty is everything, equality counts for nothing. When Rawls puts together his two principles, it looks, at least on the surface, as if he's attempting to make a compromise between the two. That is, he selects certain basic liberties, the political liberties, but he says these do come first. And these do oppose equality, and if equality would be better served by invading them, nevertheless, they must not be evaded. Now, I'm very anxious to contest the whole idea that the rights of the individual that we call liberty are antagonistic to equality. I've tried to stress in my work the degree to which rights of the individual only make sense as the consequence of a very deep kind of egalitarianism. And therefore, I wish, as it were, to change the terms of debate by asking about the claim of right. Is this right necessary to protect equality, rather than by saying how much equality need we give up in order to achieve it? Now, if the program that I thus propose can be carried out, it would seem to me to protect liberalism from an unnecessary position, namely that liberalism somehow is unconcerned with the worst off people in society. Rawls, it seems to me, shows that it needn't be. But I want to go a bit further than that and argue that there is in the motor of liberalism, in that basic conception, there is a drive towards equality, so that at every moment the defense of liberalism is itself a defense of equality.
Would it be an acceptable sort of bold schematism of the three views to say that Nozick goes for, as it were, rights without equality, Rawls goes for equality without rights? What you want to do is to insist that the two can only be even conceptualized in relation to each other, that they are mutually supportive notions?
That third certainly is my view, yes.
Yeah.
That the whole, indeed, I doubt, see, I want to say that the idea of rights itself is a very problematic idea. It's something that can't be taken for granted. It has to be rooted in something else. After all, when you say someone has a right, then in the sense that I think is the most politically powerful, what you're really saying is the general welfare must suffer, if necessary, in order to protect that right. When you take that claim seriously, then it begs for a defense. It's not intuitively defensible. It begs for a defense. Why must the general welfare suffer? Why must the majority lose out to protect, for example, someone's right to speak his mind? And it does seem to me that the only possible defense of rights must lie not in finding some idea of important values which oppose the egalitarian notions embedded in the idea of the general welfare, but something that supports both rights and the notion of the general welfare as part of an overall ideal, namely equality. It's an argument that has to be made out, but if I can just for a moment show the general structure of how that argument would go. Why, for example, do we care about prosperity? Why do we all work so that, now you will say, well, to make people better off, to make the community as a whole better off. Yes, but why is it a good thing to make people better off? Isn't there in the very idea that gains to one can be cancelled, must be set off against disadvantage to other in some sort of balance struck? Isn't that idea only defensible? This, I would argue that it is. If you suppose that the point of it all is to make sure that no one is being favored over anyone else in society. It's often thought that utilitarianism, which is the philosophy of improving the general welfare, somehow pursues, as Bentham is supposed to have said, the idea that pleasure in itself is good. Well, that seems to me absurd, that pleasure in itself is good. It seems to me that the true defense of concern to improve the general welfare of society, the true defense of that lies in something else that Bentham said. Namely, only in that way can the governors of a society, those in charge, show equal concern and respect for each person. Because what you're saying to each person is, we cannot do this for you because two others would suffer if we did. Something along that line. That is, we cannot prefer you to those two because to do so would be, since you're only one, to show favoritism to you. So it does seem to me that the first shibboleth of political theory that must be struck down is the notion that the general welfare, utilitarianism, is an anti-egalitarian. It's rooted in a certain notion of equality. But when we select political institutions in order to pursue the general welfare, then, because we can only do that, we can only use rough institutions like the marketplace or parliament or Congress to achieve this, there are certain structural inequalities that result. For example, people who aren't very clever will end up in a worse position. Not because their demands are expensive to satisfy, so it would be showing them favoritism to satisfy, but because a marketplace is going to cheat them because they weren't lucky enough to be born having the qualities other people want. Therefore, redistribution of the result of the market is required, not because it serves some value competitive with the value served by the market, but because only with redistribution can the package, market plus redistribution, fulfill the only justification for having the market in the first place, which is a basically egalitarian justification. Now, I've just taken economic rights as an illustration of how the argument must go, but it does seem to me that we have to supply arguments for these rights and can't take them as primitive.
When you said a moment ago that you and Rawls and Nozick are all, your phrase was, working the same street,
yes.
I think you said something extremely important, because academics, for example, are quite commonly inclined to regard at least Rawls and Nozick as being polar opposites. Whereas, in fact, according to your analysis, what they are both doing, and you also are doing, is defending liberalism. I suppose it would be true to say you're not just producing different defenses of liberalism, yes. You're also defending different concepts of liberalism, yes. But nevertheless that is what you're doing against attacks from both right and left. one last question I'd like to ask you before we finish this discussion is, what do you regard as the Achilles heel, so to speak, of this position that all three of you are in? I mean, where are the chief weaknesses of this position that you're all jointly defending?
Yes.
And I suppose arising out of that, the question, where do you think the most important or interesting work is likely to come in this kind of political thinking in the immediate future?
Well, could I just say that though I did say working the same street, I think it is important to emphasize that we're not all defending the same theory. We're all defending theories which make the same claim. That is, the claim to be the consequence of a liberal position. I regard Nozick's work as a challenge, a very important challenge, just because it draws what I think of as malign consequences from the position. So I'm extremely anxious to say that isn't what liberalism is. So in that way, we're opposed to one another, as the orthodox view has it. But if you go back to what I said unites us, namely this notion that political theory, a sense of justice, must be distinct from any particular theory about what the good life is, then I think the great weakness, the problem, is to defend against two attacks just at that fundamental point. And the two attacks are one theoretical and one rather practical. Theoretical attack, which must be met, is this: that the view of liberalism that I've just described rests on a nihilistic or otherwise unattractive or impoverished view of human nature, of what human beings are. You said at one point in our discussion, these opposing views take the position man is social. Well, of course, the liberal doesn't deny that, but the argument is that liberalism is committed to what's often called a Humean or Benthamite or atomistic conception of human nature, which is wrong. Now, we don't have time to go into that, but it does seem to me, first, that it's not true, but absolutely necessary for liberals now to demonstrate that it's not true and to show that the true father of liberalism, if you will, is not Jeremy Bentham, who is in fact rather an embarrassment for liberals, but Kant, whose conception of human nature cannot be called impoverished. Now, the practical problem is this. There are certain things we all want government to do. For example, to select methods of education, to sponsor culture, which on the surface look as if they are endorsing one set of values against another and therefore contradicting liberalism. It does seem to me very important for liberals to develop a theory which would make a distinction here between enriching the choices available to people and enforcing a choice upon people. The crucial idea, it seems to me, is the idea of imagination. The liberal is concerned to expand imagination without imposing any particular choice upon imagination. But I've simply named a problem, Brian. I have it. It does seem to me that liberalism is rather weak at this point and needs a theory of education, a theory of culture, support, and so forth. And that, I think, is the answer to the question, where must political theory go? You said just at the beginning of the program that for a long time people had said political philosophy is dead. Well, political philosophy has been born again and is very lively. But what hasn't quite happened yet is the integration, the reintegration of political philosophy into the body of philosophy as a whole. Because, of course, no philosophical problem worth talking about can be pulled apart from the general body of philosophy. And in the two questions I've just named, namely the question of what theory of humanity, what theory of mind is assumed by liberalism, and the question of distinguishing between enriching and constricting imagination, it's plain that political theory must escape what is normally thought to be the boundaries of questions of political institutions or strategy, and must encounter, as all the great philosophers of the past did, the connections between political philosophy and philosophy as just philosophy.
And it's very striking that nearly all the greatest political philosophers of the past, like Plato, Aristotle, Locke, Kant, were general philosophers whose political philosophy was just part of their general philosophy.
So that's the next step.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Dworkin.
Thank you.